last year was a massive failure for Denver as they hoped to compete for a Super Bowl spot and instead finished with the fifth worst record in the NFL. And now the question is, will the changes to the team and coaching staff be enough to get them to where they want to be, or is it just going to be a repeat of last year? If the Broncos are going to have more success than they did last year, it's really going to be reliant on Russell Wilson having a far better season, obviously, because he really looked fine according to the basic stats, such as yards per game and yards per attempt, because in yards per game, he was 14th. In yards per attempt, he was 13th out of all quarterbacks. He was 20th in touchdowns, but touchdowns can be a bit finicky. They're not always the most telltale sign of how well a quarterback's doing. But when you look at his advanced stats, that's where he really has the issues shine. And in the case of expected points added, he was 29th out of 37 quarterbacks that took 200 or more snaps last year. So he was about as good as a backup in that stat. And really, when you watched him play, a lot of the time, that looked about right. He was behind the eight ball a little bit because there were several injuries to the Broncos that really impacted the team. And that was sort of shown by the fact that, according to Football Outsiders, the Broncos were the most injured team in the entire league last year. So that definitely did help hold them back and made the offense look even worse than it actually was, which is saying something because it looked bad enough on its own. But the loss of Tim Patrick was pretty big. He was projected to be, at worst, their number 3 option as a weapon for them, and he missed all of last year. But really, Wilson was struggling a lot on his own as well. The deep bomb that he was so notorious for in Seattle just wasn't a thing in Denver, and you could also put some of the blame on Nathaniel Hackett, who seemed overwhelmed with being a head coach. He may be one of those offensive coordinators that can excel as a coordinator, but just is capped out there and cannot be a great head coach. So there's a lot of explanations for why Wilson was so bad last year, but at any rate, that is really going to be something that you have to be cognizant of when you're evaluating the Broncos. Is this what we're dealing with Wilson now? Is this his new normal? Is going to be a once superstar quarterback that is now just a backup level? It's hard to say. And this year is really going to be a huge tell because there's such a new regime that has had success elsewhere as far as the coaching goes, and you expect the injuries to regress towards the mean. So we're really going to see what Russell is actually made of in this upcoming year. One thing the Broncos definitely have going for them is that their offensive line should really be a strength for them this year, because this past season they ranked 17th in pass blocking and 15th in run blocking according to PFF grades. So they were a solid unit, and that's with Garrett Bowles, who's arguably their best offensive lineman, missing basically the entire year. And they also made some pretty nice additions with Ben Powers, who's one of the absolute best pass blocking guards in football. So that should help Wilson a fair bit. And they also added Mike McGlinchey as their right tackle, which is another real upgrade because McGlinchey is in that second to third tier of offensive tackles where he's not the elite, but he is certainly one of the better tackles in football. He is a premier run blocker and a really solid pass protector. So with the addition of Powers, who's going to be great as a pass blocker, and with McGlinchey, who's going to shine as a run blocker, they really have a sort of balanced line. And Bowles, again, is really going to be nice because he's really good at pass protecting and run blocking. So they're going to be pretty loaded in the offensive line department, which is really nice. Again, with Wilson not being a guarantee to be a star for them, it's nice to have that little cushion in place where they're going to have good things around him to support him. As for the rest of their line, Quinn Miners is a really nice up-and-coming guard. He is in his third year now, and he really had a good year this past season. He's one of the better run blockers in football, but he's no slouch as a pass protector. And Lloyd Cushenberry has really progressed a lot as a player. In 2020, his rookie year, he was abysmal, and he's had steady progression ever since then and is now a really solid pass protecting center. So Wilson should be pretty well protected, and they're good enough in the run game too that it won't be all on Wilson to succeed for the offense. They're going to have a ton of support in place for him, which is exactly what they need. Moving to their weapons, they really have a lot to like there as well, because to start out with Jerry Jeudy, he was 15th in yards per reception and 23rd in yards per game. So he is on the cusp of being an elite receiver, and he is not their only weapon by any stretch, because Courtland Sutton was 34th in yards per reception and 35th in yards per game as well. And Greg Dulcich, their tight end, was 6th in yards per reception and 9th in yards per game for tight ends. So even if he didn't produce at a super high level in total yards, he was super effective when he was used. And that's kind of the case for all of their receivers. They also have, obviously, Tim Patrick coming back, who has really had success in his career to this point. So he'll be a nice additional weapon for them to have. It's also pretty nice that they have a sort of thematic approach to their team, because Sutton and Patrick are both 6'4". So that's going to be a wide target radius for Wilson to hit. Jeudy is a fantastic route runner. He's going to be open. He's also 6'1", so he's not small by any stretch. And Dulcich is a really good athlete that has good route running prowess to him. So he's going to be a nice weapon for Wilson to have, and that's a pretty healthy receiving room at that point. As far as their running backs go, they are pretty set there as well, because Samaje Perine is going to be their backup. He's going to, I believe, start out the year because Javonte Williams had, I believe, an ACL injury this past season that caused him to miss the final stretch of this season. It was much of the year, in fact. So they are going to be pretty well set there. Perine is a pretty nice receiving option. He can also run the ball fairly effectively. And Javonte Williams is just an absolute stud. He is one of the better runners of the football, and he can receive a little bit. He's not really a good option in that regard, but he's not completely useless either. So in all, they have really nice weapons. Marquez Callaway is going to be their fourth option, more than likely, their fourth receiver, that is, because he's somebody that is known to Sean Payton and has had success with Payton in the past. So I think that he's going to carry over pretty nicely into Denver. Shifting to their defense now, this is where things really get good, because to start out with their defensive backs, Patrick Surtain is at a minimum a top 5 corner in this league. He had a really solid rookie year, and this past season he was on a different level entirely from that year, because he was just behind Sauce Gardner in PFF grade, and there is some nice talent behind him as well, because Damari Mathis had a really solid year as well. He's really physical in the run game. He's a really solid player as a whole. Quan Williams is really good as a slot corner as well. He's getting up there a little bit in age, but he hasn't shown any signs of slowing down, so I think it's safe to assume that he's still going to be good. At safety, they have one of the top safety groups in all of football as well. Justin Simmons is, I would say, a top 10 or so safety in football. He's really solid as a coverage guy. He can do some work in the run game as well. He's not just completely a single high safety. He can get physical in the run game a bit as well. Kareem Jackson, also getting up there a bit in age, but hasn't really shown signs of slowing down either. He's still very solid, and with him, he is more of a run defender at this point, which is interesting because he started out as a corner, but they play really nicely off each other, Jackson and Simmons, because Simmons is stronger as the coverage guy and Jackson is better in the run game. So again, they have that nice sort of balance. The one issue they have in the defensive back realm is that they don't have a ton of depth, because after their three corners and two safeties, it becomes a bit of a question mark as to who's going to be contributing for them. They do have a interesting prospect in Caden Stearns, who was a fifth round pick in 2021. He has not played very much to this point, but in his limited snaps, he's been pretty productive. So that is somebody to watch out for. After him, though, there is basically nobody you can feel even confident in as possible contributors. It's basically all entirely question marks after him. And that's okay, though. If they stay healthy, they're going to be an elite group again, because you're going to be hard pressed to find a better group of three corners and two safeties in the entire league than what the Broncos have. There is nobody that you can easily target on the back end for them. And that is such a good thing. That is what teams aspire for, because you're only as good as your weakest link in the defensive backs. And on top of that, Surtain is elite. So they have the star talent, and they have some good guys behind it as well. Moving forward to their front seven now, they're pretty darn good in that regard as well, because they made I would say a slightly positive move with basically trading Zach Allen in place of Draymond Jones. I think Allen is honestly a pretty clear-cut upgrade, actually, to Jones, because Allen is a really solid interior rusher, and he can also get it done as a run defender as well, whereas Jones was pretty much just a pass rusher, and in my opinion, he really wasn't elite in that regard either. He was solid, but I think Allen can really get it done better in both aspects, which is a bit risky because Allen really only has 3 years of solid production at this point, and this past season was far and away his best year. So it's a question of if he's going to be able to repeat the performance he had, or if he's just going to be one of those contract year breakout players that doesn't return to form at any point. But in addition to Allen, they have DJ Jones, who is another really solid interior defensive tackle. He's a really solid pass rusher and an okay run defender, which seems a little backwards because he's not very athletic, and he's also a bit undersized. So it's kind of weird that he's as good of a pass rusher as he is, and that he survives as a run defender. He doesn't seem to have the best makings of a great interior player, but he's very solid. Another thing they have going for them, though, is their edge room is pretty legit. They have Randy Gregory, who, when healthy and not suspended, which has been about 10% of his career seemingly, is a very, very good player. And he is one of the upper echelon pass rushers in the NFL, but he is not a horrid run defender either. He really shines as a pass rusher, but he's not going to be abused. He's not going to be a third down only pass rusher. He is going to be a full-time contributor when he's healthy. And they definitely regressed on the second edge position because they had Bradley Chubb as their initial edge, and now they have Frank Clark. So they definitely regressed there. Clark is not nearly the player that Chubb is, because even at his best, Clark has been somebody that's benefited from sack numbers appearing to make him look better than he actually is. He's not a truly elite pass rusher, but for reference, he still was 44th in pressures this past season, so he's not a bad player. He's just not really lived up to the contract he's had, and now he's on a more manageable one for Denver, so I think that should reel in the expectations a bit. He, again, is a solid pass rusher. He's not a very good run defender, which is frustrating because he has all the athleticism in the world to be a good run defender, but he's a solid player overall. As far as depth goes, they're actually pretty well set there as well, because Mike Purcell is one of the better rotational defensive tackles in football. He is a really, really good run defender, and he's okay as a pass rusher. That's not a strength of his by any stretch, but he's really going to be good on the early downs because he can blow up runs pretty single-handedly. And then as far as the edge room is concerned, they have a ton of potential. It's just going to be on their guys to really learn the position and refine their skill set, because Jonathan Cooper is one of the better rotational edge rushers in football. He's solid as a run defender. He can get after the passer some. Just a very good rotational piece. And then Baron Browning and Nick Benito are very similar in that they are athletic freaks that are just not refined at all at this point. Browning and Benito can both get after the passer just based on their athletic profiles. They're both a bit undersized, but are super fast and freaky acceleration for both of them. And in the case of Browning in particular, he's really learning the position. He was a linebacker as recently as this past year and is only playing as an edge rusher for part of the season. So he is really going to be getting used to the position, and I think with time he can definitely be a really solid pass rusher. The same for Benito, but they just need to refine themselves a bit. And I don't know if they're ever really going to be early down contributors because, again, they are undersized. They're both about 240 pounds. So it's going to be interesting to see what they can do. But they have a ton of guys that contribute as pass rushers. So it'll be interesting to see just how productive they are in passing situations. To round out their roster, they have a really solid linebacking duo as well, because Alex Singleton is a really underrated player. He is great at every aspect of the game. He can rush the passer some. He is a solid run defender, even for being a little bit undersized as a linebacker at 240 pounds. And he's also really solid in coverage. Josie Jewell is not quite the caliber of Singleton, but he can really thump in the run game as well, even though he's only 235 pounds. He's not going to be the best at absorbing blocks in the run game, but when he's kept clean, which is usually the case because their defensive line is solid, and they also have pretty good edge setters in Gregory and Clark now, so they have everything they need to be kept clean most of the time, which is really good because, again, they're just not going to be able to take on offensive linemen. And Jewell is not quite the coverage guy that Singleton is, but he's not a slouch in that regard either. He's pretty good. I would say he's about average to above average as a pass coverage player. And again, when he is kept clean in the run game, he is really good. He very rarely misses tackles. And the only thing that really holds him back is the fact that he is super unathletic. He ran, I believe, a 4.8 second 40 as a undersized linebacker. That's not great, but he is really aware and is just fundamentally sound. So again, their linebacking duo is really good. They also have Jonas Griffith, who is a solid piece. He's not somebody you want to bank on as a starter, but you could do worse than him being your third option at linebacker, which, again, in the modern NFL, a third linebacker is a backup, not a full-time starter. So if you have a little bit of a weakness at linebacker, that's quite all right, so long as they're not going to be an every down player, which they're not going to be tasked with. So they're really set at the linebacker position as well. And then as far as their coaching is concerned, I think that Sean Payton is a really good coach. I think he has been very moldable with his scheme throughout the years because with Drew Brees, he really showed off what he ideally wants to run, which is a quick passing game. But with Taysom Hill, he was able to change the offense around a bit, and with Winston as well, he was able to get the average depth of target up, which is something I think he's going to have to do with Russell Wilson as well, because even though Wilson wasn't really taking or having success with his deep shots like he was in Seattle, that's ideally how Wilson wants to play. He wants to kind of play in a freelance way where he's going to be ideally looking for deep plays down the field and just taking chunk plays instead of getting, 4 yards, 5 yards, 6 yards a rip. And I think Peyton is going to be able to put together an offense that is conducive to Wilson's success, but it's really going to be on Wilson to figure out just exactly how to run it to the best of his ability. And then defensively, I think Vance Joseph is a really solid defensive coordinator. I think for the most part, he's gotten more out of his defenses than the talent would suggest, because I'm particularly talking about Arizona. I'm not super familiar with his time in Denver or Miami, with honestly what the teams were like and how they performed compared to that. I can't really speak. But in Arizona, I think that there just never really was a ton of talent on the defensive side of the ball. And still, for a few of the years at least, they were solid in points per game and good in yards per game as well. And that's again with defenses you really wouldn't expect to have a ton of success. So I think with Joseph now having a defense at his disposal that is just gushing with talent, I think he can really show off his prowess and be very successful. So I think coaching wise, they're pretty well set. And in all, that really speaks to just who they are as a whole, because there is talent everywhere on this Denver team. They have the good coaching, as I just mentioned, and you can probably tell I'm pretty positive about basically every positional group they have as well. If they even had an average quarterback that I could feel confident in, just again being average, I would have them probably in the top 10 of teams. Maybe at the bottom of that top 10, but still, if you're in the top 10 with average quarterback play, that's really speaking a lot to the rest of your team. My issue is, though, I'm not sure Wilson is going to be average. I think he's going to be better this upcoming season than he was last year, just because I think Peyton has more of a likelihood of having success than Nathaniel Hackett did, because it was Hackett's first real crack at being a head coach, and this is Peyton's. It's not his first time at the rodeo, but there is still a reasonable to doubt with Wilson, because he was just really rough this past year. And the team is going to be better around him as well, so that should help. But I don't feel safe in banking on Wilson getting anywhere near where he was in years past, which is something that I still do have on the back of my mind. I think there is that real chance that Wilson's able to turn back time some and find that great quarterback that used to exist in him. But it's so hard to project with coming off of as bad of a season as he had.